Oh, hi, Michelle.
Hey.
Oh,
Happy May. Good luck.
Hello.
thank you. How's it going, Dr. Elkins?
Not bad. How are you?
You know, a little nervous, but
Yeah, it'll be great. But yeah, I mean, it is kind of a weird way to, have to do this, but
yeah.
let's see. It looks like we've got, hi, David.
Hey, how's it going?
All right.
Hi, folks.
Hello.
So yeah, looks like maybe Tom is here or joining us as well. Ben, I wanted to check with you real quick. I just want to make sure that we have, I've looked over everything with regard to the forms and stuff, and I have the departmental one that's just internal that we do. But do you have the, like the graduate school form that gets submitted? Because I think, or, I think whatever forms you need, you should be able to get from RamWeb, but.
Okay, yeah. I haven't downloaded those yet, but I should just get those.
Can check with Dr. Dunn too, because he, I believe, has done a Teams defense, and this is my first one, so I just want to make sure that yeah, we've got everything right.
Yeah, paperwork side of things.
Yep.
Yeah, the grad school is super flexible on this right now. So if you go to their website, they've got some pretty clear guidelines on how to get that done.
Yeah, I scanned through that, and I was trying to figure out if there was another form that we needed in addition to the internal departmental one.
Yeah, this. I haven't done a thesis defense on here. I did a prospectus defense, which doesn't require a grad school form yet. So,
all right. Yeah, I looked at the list of grad school forms, like all of the GS ones, and I didn't see anything either necessarily. So, maybe, yeah, maybe we don't need one, but we'll make sure we've got everything figured out and get all of the signatures and things we need. Should we?
Yeah, I can check through RamWeb, and if there's anything that I need to download and send along, that's pretty simple for me to do.
Okay, cool. All right. Yeah, well, thanks for joining us, everyone. I'll won't delay us any further, and yeah, well, I've instructed or chatted with Ben about taking some time to present the project, and then of course give us time to respond to that. As with the prospectus defense, I'll kind of hand things over. We can kind of hand things over largely to Doctors Dunn and Wolfgang, because I've had more time with Ben to chat about the project. I will take notes as I did last time. I'll keep my mic muted for a fair amount of it, just so you don't hear the clacking of my keyboard. But if I forget to unmute and start talking and you can't hear me, just let me know. So otherwise, yeah, unless anyone has anything else, so we'll hand it over to Ben.
I'm good.
Yep, sounds like everyone's good then. I guess just before jumping into like the specific presentation itself, just I guess like some logistics. I think everyone saw there's just a handful of other graduate students who wanted to watch the presentation as well. So I assume the ones who are here, and we'll all just kind of stay muted watching everything, and then we'll all quote unquote leave the room when you all are deliberating. And then as far as just like connection stuff goes, since we're meeting not face to face or whatnot, I think my internet's been working okay, but if there's ever like stuttering or stuff where I'm like cutting out and you need me to like go back over something, totally fine. We'll kind of just play all that by ear. I believe everyone should be able to see the PowerPoint slides okay. If I need to send the file, I can do that as well, but I think we're all good to go.
Looks good to me.
Awesome. Sounds great. So I believe as I click through them, it should move along, but then I think you all can click through as well. I guess any other like logistics questions, or if we're all feeling good, I'll go and jump into everything and kind of start walking us through Tumblr.
Yeah, I'm good.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, awesome. So obviously, at least everyone on the committee here has already read through the full thesis, but just to kind of lead us back into thinking about Tumblr and like these online spaces specifically, I think it might be helpful to take a moment and think through kind of like those platforms, websites, and apps that we're all using on a day-to-day basis, especially now with everyone kind of being online. It's especially more frequent. So in addition to like these social media websites that we're using, we're also like using Teams right here, relying on our emails a bunch, all these other online spaces. And I think what's really interesting and what kind of drove my questions as I was going through this project was this idea that all of these platforms, websites, and apps, like from a technical standpoint, are essentially the same, like from a technical underpinning. It's a website or, certain programming. Yet despite technically being the same, each one kind of has its own unique look and feel to it, both in terms of like its actual visual interface, but also what the purposes of it are and like the groups and communities that are there. So for instance, the reasons that an individual would use Facebook is very different than the reasons an individual would use Tumblr, for instance. And a lot of times those spaces overlap as well. Sometimes a platform clearly articulates what its purpose is. So for instance, Twitter saying it's a way to know what's happening around the world right here, right now. Others, like in the case of Tumblr, have a much more kind of open-ended definition of itself. So those differences in online spaces really kind of drove my interest in this project and kind of some of these broad questions that I was thinking about as I was developing a thesis and working through it, which is what is it that makes all these platforms different from one another? And really, when it comes to this online space of the platform, how does it become shaped and defined? And how is that shaping and definition an ongoing process? So once the platform community is established, it's not, a fixed and finalized thing, but how is that constantly changing? And most critically, which kind of came up in the case of Tumblr, what is the role of individual users in contributing to this definition and contributing to what this online space looks like? So I'm thinking about platforms and online spaces broadly, but for this project, as we all know, I'm looking specifically at Tumblr and its recently, at least towards the end of 2018, updated adult content policy as kind of the specific case study to look at a moment when a platform and its online space and its online community was kind of going through this moment of change. So I'll talk a little bit about Tumblr's more specifics in a moment, but it was this popular microblogging social network site. So as opposed to things like WordPress or LiveJournal, which are more long form, it was meant to be kind of quick off the cuff, kind of similar to Twitter in some senses. In the thesis, I'm arguing that its previously lax adult content policy, along with many of its affordances and its user community, had once contributed to its existence as an online queer space for the overwhelming majority of its existence. However, in late 2018, the Tumblr staff announced a change to the adult content policy, saying that all this adult content that had once been allowed would no longer be allowed. And in the wake of that, it completely changed the meaning of the platform and its online space. And despite the company's attempts to kind of explain the reasoning behind the new policy, the overwhelming majority of users responded very negatively to this and expressed that, which to me really underscores the many different stakeholders in an online space and who might have a reason to care about how this online platform becomes defined. I want to take a moment to, before I get into some of the specific stuff here, to note that even though this adult content controversy became colloquially known as the Tumblr porn ban, it wasn't just the porn itself that people were upset about necessarily, although that kind of became the flashpoint that most people used as central in their conversations. It is true that a good number of users had relied on Tumblr for pornography, particularly for content that was not targeted at cisgender heterosexual males, just as this kind of alternative space, and the lax policy made it possible for people to share that type of content. That wasn't the only reasons that people were coming to Tumblr as a queer space. And what I'm arguing in the thesis is that it's not so much the porn itself and the content that was significant, but what that content had represented, which was that individual freedom and individual user autonomy. And so when the policy changed to no longer allow adult content, that redefinition of the online space was characterized by losing that individual freedom and autonomy. So even users that had never actually shared pornography were affected by what the removal of the content had represented. And so ultimately what I'm getting at in the thesis as a whole is that the controversy that emerged surrounding the Tumblr porn ban really demonstrates this co-constructed nature of platforms and online spaces, where it's not just users that are defining it, it's not just companies that are defining it, and it's not just governments that are defining it, but rather the combination of all three of those forces. So what I'm going to talk about in the next several minutes, run through just a little bit of the background information, a little bit more on Tumblr, talk very briefly about the research methods. A lot of this stuff came up in the prospectus as well, so I won't dwell on it too much. I want to spend the most of the time, though, talking about the corporate communication and the users' communication about the policy itself. So moving right along into everything, like I said, Tumblr, it's this online microblogging website. It existed for over a decade now. It was originally created 2007 by this individual named David Karp, who wanted to create this alternative platform as opposed to some of the popular websites at the time. So we're thinking MySpace, Friendster, and LiveJournal. And he had always wanted to kind of be this, free and open space. So for nearly an entire decade, didn't have any limits on adult content. Only really stuff that was actually blatantly illegal was limited by the policies. Otherwise, users could share whatever they wanted. And so I argue that that policy, along with its affordances, which I'll talk about in a moment, contributed to this identity as this online queer space where individuals could actually meet and perform these various identities that might be more limited on both other online platforms, but also in the physical world too. Part of that definition came about the fact that Tumblr, for the majority of its existence, really defined itself in terms of its users. So rather than like Twitter saying, oh, we're here to share what's going on now, Tumblr only said, Tumblr is blog, so the individual users make the space what it is for the majority of its history. In addition to those policies, its affordances or features really contributed to the ability for individual users to control their own engagement with the website through what Marty Fink and Quinn Miller called a mode of engagement distinct to the site. So these affordances include like the lack of real name policies, limited profile information. So an individual Tumblr user can choose to present all facets of themselves, only some facets of themselves, or even things that aren't necessarily fully representative. So they could potentially present one persona on Tumblr that they might not have been able to or felt comfortable doing on other websites, perhaps. Also important affordances were the reblog, the curation, being able to share content without necessarily claiming authorship of it. It allows individuals to kind of create this multifaceted identity on the platform where they're not just defined by some types of content that they're directly sharing, but also kind of the content that they're engaging with. And then finally, just the customizability and the multimodality really contributes to that highly granular control that each user had over their own experiences, more so than what was available on other social media platforms, which really made it possible for the users to be the primary driving force in what the online space was, which did contribute to Tumblr being a significant online platform for several different queer communities, which has been noted in a handful of different scholarship and different studies. So Roberts and Bryan showed that among LGBTIQ plus users, use of Tumblr was significantly higher than other groups of internet users. Again, turning to Fink and Miller, they specifically are talking about the use of Tumblr for genderqueer and transgender communities and how Tumblr kind of became this gathering online space for these queer individuals. So I'm thinking about queer spaces both in kind of like the physical sense of, the actual locations for the performance of a queer identity, but then also how that can happen in this online non-physical space as well. So for instance, I'm kind of building from the work of Mary Gray, who talked about queer visibility in rural America, about how visibility is really important to establish and perform these identities, and that having a location to do that matters. And in the case of Tumblr, sometimes that space or that location where the identity performance happens is an online space and not necessarily a physical one. This is something that gets brought up by Vicky Frazier, who specifically has said that the internet can provide these opportunities for people to find and join these queer communities. And Tumblr, because of its previously lax policies, all of its affordances, and then through just its users and communities, for the longest time had been one of those online spaces, at least up until late 2018, where they announced a significant change to the policy, essentially just saying that they would no longer be allowing any adult content. So that's pornography, any sexual content, all sorts of nudity. There were a handful of exceptions, but like I'll talk about in a moment, a lot of those exceptions were really just kind of signal virtuing or virtue signaling, rather than anything else. And it was in the name of a, quote, better, more positive Tumblr, but of course, in the porn ban and the controversy that followed, basically all the users the majority of the users were opposed to it. In the wake of this new policy, there was immediately a bunch of popular press articles noting that there were all sorts of problems with this new policy and how it was going to significantly change the nature of the platform, and that it would significantly and disproportionately affect the LGBTQ plus communities that had once relied on Tumblr. In addition to all those popular press articles, a majority of Tumblr users also took to the website itself. So it was Tumblr users talking about Tumblr on Tumblr, which I'll talk about as kind of significant later. Some of them, as you can see on the right side of the screen, were kind of these long written out posts, kind of really detailed, thorough explanations. Some of them were much more kind of what's going on the left, kind of these short declarations. Today is the last day we can post about titties, y'all, in the bottom left there, really just expressing general discontent with it. And so really these user posts, along with the way that the company tried to explain the policy, represents this contention over how the online space is defined. So really briefly, I'll just talk about kind of how I ended up gathering all my content. I'm using a combination of digital discourse and critical technocultural analysis, so building from Crispin Thurlow and Andre Brock. Also using some of the work of Nancy Baim there to look at how not just what users are saying online, but how they're using the online platform itself and its affordances to make that argument. So the fact that it was Tumblr users on Tumblr mattered. So with that in mind, I wrote a simple Python scraper to grab a bunch of Tumblr posts to analyze, paired that with a critical political economic analysis that's building from, say, Jonathan Hardy, Janet Wasco, Vincent Mosco, to look at how Tumblr, the company, announced the policy through a series of blog posts, but then also how the company talked about it through its internal documents, including its SEC filings and some of its more corporate communications. Very briefly, I just want to note, kind of just from an ethical standpoint, internet research is kind of a difficult thing for universities to figure out what do we do with this on an ethical standpoint, like how does this fit in? I was following the guidelines of the Association of Internet Researchers, which basically says anything that's publicly posted online isn't going to count as human subjects research. So we don't necessarily need to go through IRB and get written approval from all the users. That said, I'm not just taking all this content online and downloading it, using it willy-nilly. They do say that the more vulnerable the population, the greater privacy protection is necessary. So I'm only using the Tumblr usernames that are available and the URLs, only quoting when it actually is necessary and makes sense, not necessarily including other photos, information when it doesn't make sense for it. Really trying to recognize that even though these users were posting in a public setting, they weren't necessarily intending for it to, get downloaded and used unexpectedly in a master's thesis project, for instance. When it comes to the Verizon Incorporated and Tumblr Incorporated communications, I have much fewer qualms about taking the communications of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, much more worried about protecting individual users, and then the publicly available Verizon documents I was happy to just download. So that brings me into the chunk about Verizon and the corporate communications of Tumblr and Verizon. So Tumblr was owned by Yahoo, now it was owned by Verizon. After this thesis was kind of starting, it actually got purchased again, but we're going to kind of just put that outside of the scope of this project. In the thesis, I'm arguing that Tumblr exists as a Janus-face corporation. This is a term that came up by John Edward Campbell, talking about a website called Planet Out in the early 2000s, which was specifically for gay and lesbian communities. And he says that a Janus-face corporation presents itself as inclusive as an inclusive community to gay and lesbian consumers, and simultaneously presents itself as a surveilling entity to its corporate clients. So it has one face that it presents to its users saying, hey, we are supportive, we want to be a space for you. And that's kind of what Tumblr was doing as well in its blog posts and announcements, trying to say, we, Tumblr, care about you, the Tumblr users. But on the flip side of that, they also have a face that they're directing towards their corporate shareholders, saying, we care about you in terms of money, and we aren't necessarily as worried about the specific users. This is kind of similar to the work of Ron Becker, who's written about television networks and how they've segmented out gay audiences and straight audiences. What's significant about Becker's work for the purposes of this project is that it's not the users who are segmenting themselves into those audiences. It's coming down from above, where the corporation is trying to put people into these different boxes, which seems to be kind of what's going on in the case of Tumblr and its porn ban, where they were trying to organize its users in a way that it could still be most effectively monetized. So what I looked at first, for one side of this Janus face, is the public-facing announcement of the porn ban. So this is how Tumblr Incorporated, through the corporate persona of Tumblr staff, announced the policy. And I argue that they employed this idea of corporate personhood to present this new policy, using blogs and kind of posting on Tumblr as if it were another user. So rather than, one of those drop-down boxes that says, hey, our terms and conditions have changed, it's just a blog post like any other user would have. And so I argue that's a way for them to try to come across as equal to the customers, not the customers, the users. And often they would also use like colloquial language. So yeah, we know you hate this term. You are Tumblr, still trying to reassert that the users are defining this space. And like I'll talk about in the next section about the user response, in the policy, they specifically said that, quote, female presenting nipples, unquote, would no longer be allowed. And there was some discussion about that presenting suffix there, which in some ways it makes them seem progressive, acknowledging that gender is not necessarily fixed. But of course, the mere fact that we're also then privileging, say, female presenting over male presenting, and the fact that even trying to assign a gender to a genderless body part doesn't make sense, really came across as just virtue signaling of them trying to present themselves as progressive. So this is the public-facing announcement of Tumblr trying to sell the policy to its users, say that it's in the interests of all the Tumblr users. If we look on the flip side, so the other side of this Janus face and the corporate communication, it's a completely different mode. So like I said, Tumblr, as far as the company goes, we're looking at it in terms of its parent company, which at the time was Verizon Incorporated. And in all of its SEC, that's the Securities and Exchange Commissions, and all of those filings, they never actually directly reference Tumblr as one of its products. It only gets mentioned indirectly in terms of the Verizon Media subsidiary and the fact that after purchasing Yahoo and Tumblr, Verizon lost $4.6 billion. So they're not necessarily talking about the online space in terms of what it's actually like for the users who are there. They're only talking about it in terms of the money that they lost. And so that's kind of the other side of this two-sided Janus face. On the one side, we're trying to serve the users. On the other side, Verizon is trying to explain to its shareholders how much money was lost on this purchase. There is one mention of Tumblr in these corporate documents. It's on the website for Verizon Media, which is one of those subsidiaries of Verizon, and they have all their online brands in there. It's buried at the bottom of a press release about a bit of corporate restructuring and renaming Verizon Media Group. There's one single bullet point where they just say, we made the important decision to change our policy on Tumblr to better position the brand to deliver on its promise to provide a safe place for communities of all kinds to thrive. That's the only mention of Tumblr. They don't talk about what the actual policy change was. They don't talk about the actual communities that are there that they're trying to protect or not protect. They're not talking about the actual user response to it. All we get is kind of this hedged language, a safe place, which kind of echoes some of the language that came up in controversies over, say, adult film, which Peter Alalunas has written about, this idea that think of the children or save the families really just kind of is a dog whistle way to protect heteronormativity And when Tumblr or Verizon is saying we want to provide a safe place for communities of all kinds, it seems to be in that same type of language where they're really trying to convince their shareholders that this was still a safe investment. So that's everything that's going on with the corporate communication from Verizon and Tumblr. The other side of this puzzle piece here is what the users were actually saying about the policy. And as I've kind of alluded to, most users were pretty upset about the policy change, and they took to Tumblr to specifically express their discontent. Like I mentioned, I had written a little Python scraper to search Tumblr, public-facing Tumblr posts by tag. I was searching for the 2 weeks after the policy was announced, but before it went into effect, and then for a month after it had gone into effect. So we kind of get 2 different timeframes there for these 4 main tag phrases here. Other researchers have noted that relying on tags for the purposes of internet research can be low-hanging fruit sometimes. However, my purpose here was to make sure that I was only getting users that intentionally wanted to talk about the policy and weren't just mentioning it indirectly. And since a user chooses their own tags, by searching specifically for these tags here, I could be sure that it was a user who wanted to express their feelings on the policy. So these here are the numbers of how many posts I got back for each. It does look like a lot. I will note a lot of these were duplicated since you can have more than one tag on a Tumblr post. So a lot of people, for instance, wrote both porn ban and community guidelines on their post. So it's slightly less numbers that were here, still was quite a lot here for me to sift through. Reading through all these different posts, there are several different broad themes that kind of emerged in how users were responding to this. I'll just touch on some of those here. First things first, I want to note that not everyone was universally opposed to the policy. There was a very, very small minority of users who actually expressed satisfaction with the new ban on pornography. There was one user who had said, quote, "Fuck these people, peddle your shit on dedicated porn sites," unquote. So still kind of using that, colloquial language, kind of similar language as many of the other users, but actually saying, no, I'm happy to see that this content is no longer on this online space that I want to be in. Of course, that was the minority. Most users were what were in this second category, which I'm just kind of calling broadly, fuck you, Tumblr. It was these short statements, not necessarily this broad, long, drawn out things like some of these other ones were, simply just saying, I really don't like this policy. I disagree with what this policy is doing to what this online space was. As one user said, quote, "Hey, Tumblr staff, get fucked with a cactus," unquote. And so pretty colorful language to express how these Tumblr users didn't like what Tumblr staff and Tumblr Inc. were doing to Tumblr, the platform. There was also discussion of the female presenting nipples phrase, saying that it's a way for Tumblr to seem like they're being progressive, but actually still trying to privilege certain bodies over others. These were some of those posts that were a little more written out and more thorough. So for instance, some people noted that the fact that they, one, are still privileging certain so-called male presenting nipples over female presenting nipples, pretty sexist already. But then also the fact in the exceptions for this policy. So for instance, they created exceptions for photos of female presenting nipples in connection with breastfeeding and childbirth, which seems great on the one hand, but then on the other hand, it's kind of tacitly endorsing breastfeeding and childbirth as a more acceptable form of femaleness than, say, women who don't give birth or don't breastfeed their children. So even these exceptions that seem like they're being progressive are still privileging certain bodies or others. Moving on, other users noted just this overall ineffectiveness of the policy. So by that, I mean that like there was actually more pornography on Tumblr, more visible porn after the ban went into effect. There were still these fake accounts sharing porn. One user even suggested that Tumblr was actually now a less safe place for minors, especially since that after the policy went into effect, there was no longer the ability to turn on safe mode or filter out anything tagged as adult content. So now any minors using the website had no way to filter any of this content out, and there was now more porn. There were also many users who specifically bemoaned the loss of a queer space, noting that Tumblr had been this important online space for them, and that even if they hadn't been using it for pornography, they felt that losing the adult content was going to change the nature of the space for them. And they really felt that they were losing not just an important part of what the space was, but an important part of their own identity expression. And then finally, I just want to note that there were some users who talked about this in terms of the First Amendment or as an issue of freedom of speech. From a legal standpoint, that claim doesn't really have any merit. Like Tumblr as a company can choose to limit whatever content it wants. It's not users being censored and their free speech rights being trampled upon. But the fact that these users felt that Tumblr had once been this open and free space, and then when they lose the allowance of adult content, it feels like they're kind of having some of that freedom taken away from them. That really underscores how the online space, just through the nature of a policy change, became kind of reshaped and redefined. One user even said, "We want back our Tumblr. At staff, I'm truly done with your bullshit." And I think that the phrase "our Tumblr" is really significant there. The users who are not the actual owners of Tumblr, are not Verizon, are not Tumblr, aren't shareholders, still feel like the space is theirs and they want their communities to be able to control it. And through this porn ban, they realize that they don't actually have as much control over this space as they had once had before. Ultimately, through all of these different posts, what I'm seeing is that there is no one singular understanding of the platform. So if we were to ask what is Tumblr, every single user is going to have a slightly different definition of that, of what it means to use this space. There are so many countless communities and users that are kind of overlapping and intersecting with one another. So even if we're thinking about a platform in the Tarleton Gillespie sense, you know, this single uniform online space, it's not a single online space, and each user kind of has their own individualized platform, which comes to be, which I'll talk about in a moment, through multiple different factors. So in the last section of my thesis, I'm talking about the Platform Triad, which is my conception of how these platforms are defined and shaped. So like I said, I'm arguing that a platform, an online space, is not this single monolithic, unchanging entity, this thing that's just there. And instead, it's this thing that emerges through this triad of users, corporations, and governments, through user practices, corporate policies, and state power. All three of those kind of contribute to what this online space is and what it means to its users. Of course, all three of these don't necessarily have equal standing with one another. As we saw in the case of Tumblr, the corporation was able to define the space a lot more than its users were able to. But the fact remains that all three of these still kind of contribute to online spaces. In the case of Tumblr, it was users and company that were in conflict with one another. But perhaps for other platforms like Facebook, government might have a lot more of a prominent role within it. Ultimately, because users are still a part of this triad, we don't necessarily have to think of the future of the internet as this wholly bleak and negative thing. A lot of current media studies discourse, in my view, tends to lean towards this pessimistic, oh, everything is awful. But I think that the fact that Tumblr users can still be a part of that triad and contribute to that definition, it means that Tumblr still has the potential to still be an online queer space. It wasn't the content itself that was, key to everything. It was what that content represented. And just because users may have felt a loss of autonomy or freedom here, there still is the ability for them through their individual practices to continue defining the online space. And even though I've been looking just at Tumblr in this thesis, I think that this platform triad can be potentially useful for all sorts of online spaces and platforms as well. So with that being said, that was kind of just like the top level overview for everything. At this point, I am looking forward to questions, comments, concerns, discussion, any questions that anyone may have. So.
Excellent. Thanks, Ben. We can kind of hand it over to, I don't know if Dr. Dunn or Dr. Wolfgang want to sort of start us off with any kind of initial questions.
Sure, I can start off with some, if that's okay. First off, Ben, excellent work. I was really impressed with the quality and what I saw. I really thought that you made your points really clearly, and you had some interesting contributions. I do want to notably start right with this conversation about the triad, though, because it was a little clearer to me today watching this presentation than it was from reading the thesis this idea that there is an inequitable relationship among the three parties or the three actors, because they're not. Yeah. So I was going to ask about that, and then I was glad that you brought it in there. But I think there is an opportunity to kind of address that more in the actual thesis itself, especially in the kind of the area where you're really explaining it. Because as I'm reading the thesis, I keep getting this kind of idea that we're not acknowledging maybe to the full extent that there is an inequitable status, that yes, they all have a part to play, but it's really not an equality kind of situation. But you also talk in the thesis about this shift when the porn ban goes into place, where there's from the user to the company, that this kind of relationship kind of had this transition at that period. How do you see or express like that power dynamic happening during that shift?
Yeah, so thank you for the question there. I think the shift is really happening. I mean, obviously it's in just like the actual policy itself, but I think we see it most clearly articulated and kind of like as the shift is happening through those public facing blog posts where Tumblr staff is trying to kind of say, oh, like the users are still defining this space, while in the same breath saying, but we also are going to start imposing these rules here. So that to me feels like kind of the most evident moment where you see this shift in the communication. So, if you go back a couple of years prior, like Tumblr CEO was saying, like, I don't care about the porn. You can do anything you want on Tumblr, where suddenly in these blog posts, you're now kind of seeing this much more kind of precise and careful language to say, yes, you, the users, are Tumblr, but also we want to define things more clearly ourselves. And so I think finding those moments of shifting is really important. So you don't want to just like take this triad and, apply it to any platform space and just leave it as is. But I think kind of finding those moments as like it's being pushed and pulled one way or the other is kind of the most fruitful use of it. As a way for users to recognize that, yes, maybe it does feel like the corporation has, significantly more power over the platform than I, as the user, do, but there is still at least some potential role of the user there, even as things are shifting. It's not necessarily like a full unilateral shift, I suppose.
And then how much of that maybe is the user having some sort of authority or power beforehand, or how much of it is having the illusion of having some kind of power beforehand?
I think as much as I don't want to be, super pessimistic, I think a lot of it is more like the illusion of control. So even as Tumblr had been saying, like before the porn ban, oh, like you can do whatever you want on Tumblr. It's a great platform for pornography. The technical reality was that, Tumblr Incorporated could change anything about the website. Like they could take it down today if they really wanted. And that's kind of always there looming. But the fact that they hadn't, and that they had for so long tried to pay service to, its users, communities, defining itself in terms of blogs, created not just like actual power for users, but a lot of it was kind of this illusion there as well. So it's not just users having control over their own experience. They have to recognize that they have control over their own experience as well.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I don't want to take it to the position where we have to take some agency away from the user. We want to believe that there was some kind of dynamic there that was more valuable. But I get the impression from reading it that based on what you saw and what you were hearing, that there's probably an argument to make that, or stronger argument to make within the paper, that the institution had more power and influence, and this is not necessarily the kind of equitable relationship we would have liked even beforehand, and maybe just to kind of parse the language a little more to kind of make that clear in there, because this form of symbolic power can be really powerful, and it's not always the kind of like it's not always as present as we might always see within the content. So but I think it's interesting how you kind of drew that out and pulled it out, especially in terms of the triad, and kind of showed it in that relationship. I'm just curious if there's a way to kind of maybe pull back a little bit on how much control or authority the audience might have had beforehand, but yeah, with a pessimistic kind of understanding as well, because it's disappointing, but yeah.
And that might just be like the reality of like once if a website starts as a small community, when, it's relatively small, each user is able to have more control. But as it kind of grows and becomes a bigger thing, perhaps inherently users are just going to lose some of that agency as it becomes more institutionalized.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing I just wanted to ask about is where do you see this triad fitting in a more practical sense with some of the theory that you were relying on about online communities, about social networking sites and platforms? How does this fit into in terms of a contribution, really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the biggest contribution comes, I mentioned it kind of briefly in the presentation here, with this kind of definition of the online platforms in general. So thinking of Charlton Gillespie and the politics of platforms. And I'm grossly oversimplifying here when he's saying that, these online spaces exist as kind of these somewhat level platforms. Like, he acknowledges that term itself becomes kind of this way for a company to kind of present itself as an open space, while also still being able to kind of serve its own needs. So he uses YouTube as a specific example. So I think that this triad can really kind of help nuance or kind of add another way to explain that distinction there, where, the platform means one thing to the company and whoever its owners are, means another thing to its users entirely. And so I think that being able to look at the platform in terms of these three different parties or groups can kind of be a useful way to kind of get at how the same online space might look different for these different actors.
Yeah, and Gillespie is exactly who I was thinking of and hoping you would come back to. So nice. I think, yeah, at some point you have the ability to kind of come to develop it into an abstract level where you can talk about the platforms in a sense where it's not about, the unique problems specifically happening in each one, because YouTube has the same kind of regulatory and corporate kind of institutional influences that can cause, from a sociology perspective, the exact same kind of approach, just looking at a different problem, maybe like copyright or some of the other issues that really dominate on YouTube. So I mean, opening up that conversation in the end of your paper to kind of draw out the opportunities to talk about where other platforms could be studied through similar kinds of approaches, I think really go far to show that you can make a contribution in terms of where you're going with the paper. A few other things that I noted, but I won't kind of draw into the conversation, and I can just, like, they're really minor things, like even a spelling error that I can send in an email to you, Ben, that aren't worth us kind of going through right now. But otherwise, I thought it was really great, and I was impressed and enjoyed reading it, and I think you've got something really good here.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll happily jump in. Thanks, David. I agree with all of David's points here, right? Some of the media industries and media scholarship is not my area of expertise, so I defer to my colleagues on some of that. But I think as a general argument, I was really impressed with all of the progress you've made since the prospectus. I like this idea of the triad at the end with the caveat, as David sort of suggested, about, how clear we are about the equitability of the different players in that moment. The framing, I think, is just the issue. I think you understand sort of these issues, but the framing can be tightened up a little bit to make that a little clearer. And I also like David's last point too, particularly about sort of the more generalizable ways that you could sort of run with this as well. Which brings me back to a question I think I asked a little bit in the prospectus, but I'm going to ask slightly differently here as well too. If I said, granted, if we acknowledged up front in the thesis, the way that it's written right now, that the people, many of the users on Tumblr and many of the people most directly affected by the porn ban were people who I identified as LGBT or queer. With that caveat sort of made in, let's say, page 3 of the thesis, would it radically alter your paper to remove the term queer online space and just have it be minority online space or marginalized community online space? In your estimation, would that radically alter the conclusions of your project or the way that you thought through the project or anything like that?
That's a good question. I think in some ways, it would leave the project similar in terms of like the ultimate conclusion about kind of like the shape of these online spaces and how they become defined. Because like I'm saying, it's my feeling is that this kind of happens on all sorts of spaces. I think though, as far as getting to Tumblr specifically, the queer framing becomes a good way to get at the specific marginalized communities. So instead of trying to talk about broadly all these minority communities, even though like, as we know, the term queer is still this kind of broad umbrella term. The fact that Tumblr had kind of existed as this alternative platform and largely had this queer identity, I think is significant because we see the shape of the online space changing because of the policy change, and that becomes one specific way to pinpoint that. So that way I'm making a specific argument about how the space is changing as the users are perceiving it. So I think in some ways, yes, it could be, essentially the same argument and it wouldn't, necessarily radically change it there. But I think since I'm trying to use Tumblr as this main entry point or case study for it, and that's how a lot of other scholarship has looked at the nature of this online space, I think to me, it makes sense to at least enter into it that way and then at least perhaps move into that broader argument.
Yeah, I actually think that's probably a good answer, right? And it's not because, as somebody who's invested in all this sort of queer work and who puts queer scholarship sort of at the center of what I do, I think it's both an opportunity and sort of a recognition of limitation to sort of say that this project contextually happens to focus on this community that's affected by that, and yet it doesn't necessarily have to or maybe benefit from an engagement with some of the deep theoretical underpinnings of what a term queer means in here, right? This is just one of the tricky ways of doing some of this work, right?
Yeah.
Is that queer, unlike maybe some other interdisciplinary areas of study, brings with it about 1,000 different meanings and 1,000 different implications to it. And you might mean, as you move forward with this project into whatever it looks like in the next stage, you might just decide to make a choice about how much of your time you want to spend on that, right? Because, and I'll send you some of these comments too. There's nitpicky comments I can make sort of throughout the project that says, I'd like a fuller explanation of this here, or how do you cite this person, or why didn't you cite X person, which from my reading would make the thesis stronger and would make your case more compelling, and yet probably wouldn't alter the overarching conclusion of where you're going and what you're arguing about it, right? Which gets to this generalizable contribution claim that we were talking about earlier, right? The project is, the biggest contribution of the project is that, I find this convincing, right, that this happens to lots of different communities across a bunch of different platforms in a variety of different ways. And so there's some really interesting stuff to do that there. I guess one other way to sort of think through this is that as I was thinking about you sort of using this term online queer space, the term kind of falls out of the dissertation in chapters 2 and 3, and it kind of pops up again a little bit more in chapter 4. Some of that's just based upon what you're looking at, right? Verizon Media is not going to use the term online queer space, right? But when it starts to go, when some of these terms start to fall out as you move over 60, 70 pages of a document, it starts to raise some of these questions about, how central is it? Do I need it? What values it has, right? So I guess that's just a broad overarching kind of thing to keep in mind about that, right? One of the other points, I guess this is a point, and then I'll come back to a question here in a second, connected to this is that, and I'll point to a couple things in the notes that I send you. There are a couple places in the document where it feels like you're prioritizing secondary sources over primary sources in some of your explanations. It's not that you don't have both of them, but a lot of your organization at the paragraph level tends to say, here's a really good explanation of this, which is a fifth removed paraphrasing of somebody's idea, and then you get back to the primary source person later on.
rearranging stuff there.
Yeah, just swapping that. That's just a writing note, right? Which I don't think undermines the project at all. I don't think that's something you need to go back and change at this stage, but it's just sort of something to be keeping in mind going forward. That citation politics stuff is tricky and a little dicey. People get annoyed about those things depending on who they are, right? So that's just a note to kind of keep in mind going forward. But let me pull up the other thing I was going to ask about here. I guess the other thing that I would like to see you just talk briefly about, related again to this issue of queer, is just sort of, as you've now gone through the entire project, right? And as particularly as you return to the idea that this could still be an online queer space at the end in your conclusion, right? When you use queer in that context, it's very clear to me that one way you're talking about it is to sort of think about it as, identity formation, right? As a particular tool for expressing identity, for claiming identity and doing that. Is that the primary way you're thinking of using that? Do you feel, is there any other sort of key ways of thinking about queer that you are sort of keying in on in the framework, either as you talk about it in the beginning, which was more familiar to what you were doing in the prospectus, or at the end, that's sort of worth pulling out at this stage?
I think potentially the only other, so I think the identity formation and presentation, I think, is kind of the main thing that I see just happening just before the porn ban, and even just like in some of the stuff that people were talking about. I think one thing that I might want to think about try to developing more is this idea of just queer visibility. So for even for users who weren't Tumblr users before the porn ban, it kind of had this alternative identity to it. People had a sense of what Tumblr was, even if they never used Tumblr. And so one thing that these questions have gotten me thinking about is, what is that perception now after the fact? And so, for instance, one, are people still using Tumblr for this online identity construction? Perhaps they are. I would be surprised if they're not. It probably just looks a little different. But then also for people outside of Tumblr communities, how are they still seeing this platform as a whole? Are they seeing these queer identities more visible because of Tumblr, or is it no longer serving as that? So that might not necessarily be something I want to dive too far into before it becomes a whole other project, but at least just like raising the question there of like, okay, where do we go next from here, I guess? Yeah. No, I think that's a good way to think about it. The other one that I was thinking about related to this idea of queer, right, is that in some ways people, to oversimplify this, right, will categorize something as queer to indicate explicitly that it is that it is taking an adversarial tone against something, right? That it is not just counterculture or not just subculture, right? But that it is subculture and pissed off and trying to, screw something over, right? Trying to undermine whatever the mainstream is or the normative is in a particular context, right? And so one of the things that just kept popping in my head as I read the conclusion, right, when you think about, could this still be an online queer space? An argument exists that could say the users who are on Tumblr now, who are doing some of this identity formation work, or who are creating these fake accounts and circulating porn still, in some ways are doing something that people would more easily recognize as queer than some of the stuff that people are doing before the porn ban comes in, right? Yeah. Because it is taking on this political activist, countercultural, fuck the man kind of tone, at least, if not in action, right? And so thinking about it was an interesting thing in the background here to sort of say, maybe there's something that's different about the queerness that's happening in the post-ban stage than opposed to the other one, which helps flesh out your argument a little bit more in the conclusion that this could still be an online queer space. It's the different vision of queer, but it's still queer in that kind of way. But, right. And the fact that it's the same people who had been there before, I think is significant. And then even if we did, lose a significant amount of the user base, I like exactly what you're saying. The people who remained are kind of like the most, strongly holding these beliefs.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm one of those people who, after the porn ban went into effect, I was like, screw Tumblr. I hate Tumblr. This is such a cop out. I'm not even going to be I deleted my username. I wasn't interested in any of the content from the platform in any way anymore. But there are other people there who are actively like rise to that occasion to,
let's dig in our heels now.
Right.
Now I'm really feeling, yeah.
Right. So it's just another way to sort of add to that conclusion that you point to, right? Those are sort of my primary concerns. Really, this is an exceptional project, both in the way that it's written, in the attention to detail that you've made about methodological choices and why you're making those kind of choices. I love the fact that you're looking at both this outward facing and inward facing discourse that's being produced both to the users and to stockholders, right? There's just so many things that I really like about this. I would say moving forward, then the questions for you just become about cost benefit analysis, right? I don't think there's a lot that you need to change about the project right now in order for it to be in really good shape. It's just a matter of, as you proceed with this project, or if this project turns into something else down the road, making some choices about, do I need this term? How deep of a rabbit hole do I need to go down in order to use a particular concept or ideas, and recognizing that it might also, freeing yourself of some of that might give you an opportunity to think about some of these things more holistically as well. So I thought it was great. I think it's a really good project, so you should be really proud of yourself. And yeah, that's really all I had.
Thank you.
All right, excellent. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think Dave and Tom covered some of the sort of questions that I had, or, kind of larger things to think about. One of the things, maybe sort of drawing some strands of some of what they said together, one of the things that I'm kind of interested in is, again, sort of thinking about this moving forward, right? Like the larger theoretical kind of construct of the platform triad, and kind of, this sort of larger question of kind of thinking about how platform identities are negotiated among political, economic, and sort of user and kind of corporate branding strategies all sort of cohering together, right? And I think the point, the suggestion to really think about those inequities more is a really good one. How do you see, this is, again, maybe less of a question for this specific project, but again, just kind of informing your work moving forward. I mean, this is an example, right, where the dynamics of kind of clashing user and company defined or company sort of led definitions of a platform are very acute, right? Like, and the ways that identity and sexuality, come out in those are very sort of clear, right? It's a band that speaks to how people sort of define and express identity, and it does feel like this very kind of this moment where we see kind of a clash from the top down and the bottom up. Now, I think that your discussion of the triad sort of nuances that a little bit, right? That it's not necessarily that simple, but yeah, I mean, how do you envision kind of the utility of this sort of triad construct moving forward? Like thinking about other platforms, or how platforms how a platform's identity is crafted, perhaps in instances where the kind of political and identity-based sort of clashes aren't as sort of outwardly visible as something like this, right? Which feels like this kind of moment of rupture. Does that question make sense?
I think so. I think I can try to
Okay.
piece it together, then you can let me know if I've answered what you're trying to get at here.
Sure, I was kind of trying to like work my way there as I was asking it too. So
very, very fair. I think in general, as far as just like the utility of this platform triad, it's really good for kind of just trying to take any online space or platform, whether it is in a moment of rupture or even if it's just, kind of in its ongoing day-to-day operations, and then try to tease out what is this online space beyond just, okay, here's what, what the website splash page says, what it's for,
Yep.
whatnot. Like I was kind of mentioning, it's going to look different for any different user versus what the company wants out of it. And we kind of see these discourses a little bit, the fact, this whole idea of like social media users as an audience commodity. That's something that a lot of people are familiar with. But I think that this triad is a way for us to kind of nuance that a little bit more and get beyond just, okay, yes, you are being sold by Facebook, but what does that really mean? Like the fact that, yes, Facebook is taking advantage of us to, monetize our data, yet at the same time, all these communities are still turning to it, knowing full well what the company's doing. It still is serving this role for individual users. Since I brought up Facebook, I think that's actually a really good example of a moment where we see more of the state power directly involved with it, especially with like, congressional hearings where they, drag Mark Zuckerberg before Congress to ask, what are you doing to regulate the platform? That's kind of where I guess that's more of a moment of rupture, but you kind of see, okay, yes, Facebook is, a surveilling entity for the company. It's a connection opportunity for its users and potentially like political activism or not political activism. So I think it's kind of, to tie it all back together, the triad becomes a way to see all these things that a platform space is doing and serving as, beyond just kind of, a simple Facebook is evil or, anything like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I like the triad idea, right? Because I think it nuances it beyond that sort of like top down versus bottom up kind of like binary. And it is, in some ways kind of comparable to Gillespie's idea of the regime of alignment, but Gillespie's idea is still much more kind of top down in nature, right? That idea of all of these different institutions kind of locking together in order to impose a certain kind of regulation on, the platform's users, right? So this kind of allows you to look at a few of these sort of different vectors of power and influence, right? But I think the point is a good one, right? That there's still, it's maybe in this kind of triad shape, but that the power dynamics are certainly not equal or equivalent, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think one thing that as I'm kind of thinking about that conclusion and how I want to nuance it a little bit more is the fact that, it can't ever be a full, 100% top down, because if the company eliminates the users, like that's, what they need for the platforms, they have to keep them at a certain amount. But, obviously, like we've talked about, it is heavily slanted one way, not in the favor of the everyday person.
Yeah. Great.
And that's one of the things of it, I think, though, too, right, is that it's an analytical tool that's really helpful, is that one of your contributions is not necessarily to say, this is how it works, and in every case it's equitable or something like that, but to be able to say, these dimensions need to always be considered when we look at how these platforms are sort of defining themselves, right? That while the users almost certainly don't have as much control, the attention that you have to pay to the user in contributing to this, I think, is one of the meaningful contributions of the project.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Totally agree. Other questions, thoughts from the committee? All right. Well, so are we ready to have Ben kind of virtually step outside, which I guess is into the chat, and then we let him back in, and we can talk about